Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiriduluale, the headlines. Ukraine's president says Severodonetsk battle may decide eastern Ukraine's fate. 2 Britons, 1 Moroccan risk death penalty after pleading guilty in a Donetsk court. And Russian and Turkish foreign ministers meet on Ukraine crisis, as well as food corridors. As we have been reporting, most of Severodonetsk is now under Russian control, and Ukrainian fighters now only hold the city outskirts, and that's according to the regional governor. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says defenders of the city were inflicting major losses on Russian troops during what he called a very fierce and very difficult battle. In his nightly video address, Mr. Zelensky says that fighting for Severodonetsk may determine the future of the wider eastern Donbas region. According to Serhiy Hedga, who is the regional governor, Ukrainian forces pulled back to the outskirts of Severodonetsk in the face of a fierce Russian assault, another big swing in momentum in one of the bloodiest battles of the war.
Severodonetsk remains the epicenter of the encounter in Donbass as a result of this day and night. Already, the 105th day of a full-scale war, we are defending our positions and are inflicting tangible losses to the enemy. This is a very brutal battle, very tough, perhaps one of the most difficult throughout this war. I am grateful to each and every one who is defending this direction. Largely, that is where the fate of our Donbass is being decided now. I had a conversation with German Chancellor Scholz, partially regarding the decision in favor of Ukraine's candidacy, which, in fact, will be a decision in favor of Europe. We also talked about defense support, as well as food security, the guarantee of which has already become a global interest because no one, except the Russian state, would be interested in a global food crisis.
Meanwhile, Russia's United Nations ambassador Vasily Nebenzia says Russian forces are progressing in the eastern Donbas region. He dismissed comments about Moscow's operation stalling or not moving as envisaged, saying progress is being made. According to him, nobody promised to deliver victory in 3 or 7 days. And 2 Britons and a Moroccan who were captured while fighting for Ukraine could face the death penalty after pleading guilty in a court of one of Russia's proxies in eastern Ukraine. That's according to the RIA news agency. Video published by the RIA showed Britons Aidan Iceland and Sean Pena and Moroccan Brahim Sadoun in a courtroom cage with white bars. RIA said Pena and Sadoun had pleaded guilty to actions aimed at the violent seizure of power. The video appeared to show Arslan pleading guilty to a lesser charge involving weapons and explosives. He was seen standing in the cage and leafing through a sheaf of legal documents as the charge was translated to him. The news agency quoted prosecutors as saying the combined charges could mean the death penalty for all 3. Britain's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office did not immediately respond to a request for comments. On the video of the previous hearing released on June the 7th, Arslan, Pena and Sadoun were seen confirming that they knew charges against them and agreeing to proceed their cases without witnesses. It is not clear whether they were speaking freely. The trial is taking place in the Donetsk People's Republic, one of 2 breakaway Russian-backed entities in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, which Russia says it is fighting to liberate from Ukrainian forces.
If Boris Johnson really does care, like he says he does, about British citizens, then he would help pressure Zelensky to do the right thing and return Victor to his family and return us to our families.
Obviously, I understand that Mr. Medvedchuk has been detained, and we look to exchange myself and Aidan Aslin for Mr. Medvedchuk.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met his Turkish counterpart Mevlut Cavusoglu in Ankara yesterday to discuss the ongoing Ukraine crisis and a possible sea corridor for Ukraine's goods export. Speaking at a press conference after the 90-minute meeting, Mr. Cavusoglu expressed optimism, saying the atmosphere for resuming talks between Russia and Ukraine is more positive than it was a few weeks ago. The United Nations has proposed a cooperation mechanism between Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the United Nations to ensure Ukraine's grain exports to the global market. According to Mr. Cavusoglu, the Turkish side thinks this mechanism is reasonable and feasible, but the plan still needs to be approved by Russia and Ukraine. Speaking on the same occasion, Mr. Lavrov said Russia has not hindered a solution to the export issue and is willing to cooperate with the Ukrainian side to solve the problem. On the same day, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Ukraine is discussing the Black Sea food corridor solution with the United Nations, but added that the sea lanes needed to be opened with help from fleets of Western countries trusted by Ukraine. The head of the region where a major agricultural storage facility was struck on June the 5th says Russia is attacking food and agriculture targets in Ukraine in order to scare the world into agreeing a deal to reopen the Black Sea on Moscow's terms. Vitaly Kim, governor of the Mykolaiv region, explains that Moscow wanted to make global food shortages look like a catastrophe. Mr. Kim was speaking as Turkish efforts to ease a global food crisis by negotiating safe passage for grain stock in ports in the Black Sea were being met by some resistance. The Turkish plan, he said, was a good idea, but all depends on the cost and what Ukraine should pay for opening the Black Sea.
They want to do this because they're trying to trade about opening the Black Sea for trade, and that's why they shoot more. And they shoot the agricultural enterprises and even fields, to burn the fields, just for their own movie, that fields are on fire. When they shoot in agricultural enterprises and grain facilities and storages, they're trying to make the situation look like that is a catastrophe in agriculture and food sector of economics in the whole world. That's why they roll in the news that it is bad, it is a catastrophe, etc. Why? Because they saying, okay, we can let you go with the trade, but give us something instead. I don't know, it's not a bad idea. It depends on the cost that we should pay for it.
The Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council in Russia, Alexei Danilov, says Ukraine will resume grain exports only when its own security is ensured. Speaking on national TV, Mr. Danilov recalled a statement by the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which clearly said that the first issue is security, the second issue is security, and the third issue is security. Mr. Danilov stated, without specifying what exactly he meant by the term security, that if this issue was not resolved and the security of Russia was not ensured, no grain will go anywhere, stressing that nobody wants the world to be hungry. And a Ukrainian official has accused Russia of stealing about 600,000 tons of grain from Ukraine that he claimed was later transported to the Middle East. In a statement, Denis Machuk, deputy chairman of the Ukrainian Agrarian Council Public Union, claims the grain was stolen from occupied regions in the south of the country. He claimed the grain was transported to the port of Sevastopol in the Russian-occupied territory of Crimea before onward shipment to the Middle East. Russia has not yet responded to Mr. Machuk's accusations. And a top official from Russia's Committee on Constitutional Legislation and State Building is saying Russia has no legal obligation to facilitate the export of grain from Ukraine. Andrei Klishus wrote on Telegram, "Let's note that Russia simply has no legal obligations to build logistics chains for the export of grain from Ukraine or somehow facilitate this export. There are simply no legal obligations." In introducing the second report of the Global Crisis Response Group on the impact of the war in Ukraine on the food, fuel and finance sectors, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres says this year's food crisis is about lack of access. Next year's could be about lack of food. The UN Global Crisis Response Group report says that the war has exacerbated a global cost of living crisis unseen in at least a generation and is undermining the UN goal of ending extreme poverty around the world by 2030. Briefing journalists in New York, Mr. Guterres says the war's impact on the food, fuel, and finance sectors is systemic, severe, and speeding up.
President-elect Korosi brings a broad perspective to his new post. A familiarity with the United Nations from his time as permanent representative, expertise in environmental sustainability, and steadfast commitment to multilateral action. I welcome the focus of his presidency on solutions to solidarity, sustainability, and science, and I count on him to help us advance across the spectrum of our work.
Together with the war in Ukraine and other armed conflicts elsewhere, they create a perfect storm, an unprecedented instability for the years to come. Therefore, we should seek integrated solutions to the systemic challenges. There is no way back to the old normal. The only way out of the current predicament is through continued reforms and transformation of this organization and strengthening our cooperation. We must do much better on delivering on our jointly agreed goals, commitments, and pledges.
Ukraine has filed 8 more war crime cases in court in addition to 3 sentences already handed down to Russian soldiers. In televised remarks, prosecutor Irina Venediktova said in total, Ukraine has now opened more than 16,000 investigations into possible war crimes during Russia's invasion, adding that these included people who didn't just come as military combatants, but also came to rape and kill civilians, loot, humiliate, and so on. Moscow denies allegations that its troops have committed any war crimes. The border from Ukraine since war broke out there, according to the UN Refugee Agency. It said the number of individual refugees from Ukraine recorded across Europe stood at over 4 million, with Poland, Russia, and Moldova amongst the top host countries. Drone footage shot at the start of the conflict showed queues of cars for miles as Ukrainians tried to escape the violence. Most at women, children, and the elderly, as men under the age of 60 have been stopped from leaving by Ukrainian authorities. Yet, as the war drags on, it is unclear when the refugees might return or what shape their homes will be in when that is possible, so the need for longer-term housing plans will still be needed. South Korea's foreign ministry says it will provide $1.2 million to support the safe operations of Ukraine's nuclear power plants that are under military threat amidst the ongoing war with Russia. The support will be provided through the International Atomic Energy Agency. According to the ministry, the government will actively support the IAEA's efforts for safe operations of the nuclear power plants in Ukraine and participate in other international efforts related to peaceful usage of nuclear power. The decision was announced during an IAEA board meeting in Vienna, Austria. In Seoul, Foreign Minister Park Jin expressed regret over the war as he met with Ukraine's Vice Foreign Minister Dmytro Senik. U.S. President Joe Biden's administration has issued new investment restrictions that prohibit Americans from buying Russian stocks and bonds. The ban is the latest step by U.S. officials to crank up the financial pressure on Russia in response to Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. According to new guidance issued at the beginning of the week by the Treasury Department, U.S. investors are prohibited from buying both new and existing debt and equity securities issued by an entity in the Russian Federation. Up till now, Americans were able to buy Russian stocks and bonds that change hands in secondary markets. Americans will still be allowed to sell Russian stocks and bonds, although to a non-U.S. person. The Treasury said Americans are not required to divest Russian securities and may continue to hold them according to the guidance. And U.S. investors can also still invest in U.S. funds that own Russian securities as long as those Russian holdings are not the bulk of the fund's assets. Russia's deputy prime minister said the country's economy has been growing in spite of sanctions. Measures taken by the president of the Russian Federation, the government, and the Bank of Russia, the economic war against the country did not go according to the plan of those who unleashed it, and that's according to Alexei Overchuk during a conference on cooperation between Russia and Kazakhstan in the latter's capital, Nur-Sultan. He said Russia's economy grew by about 1.7% over the last 4 months. And coming up after the break, China's Huawei closing retail stores in Russia. Please join us again. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Let's go all the way to Almaty in Kazakhstan, where we're being joined virtually by Professor Denis Soltis, who is of the Department of Public Administration and International Development at the Kimep University. Thank you so much for your time. Good morning to you. I'm not actually sure it's morning, but a good day to you. And how is it this morning that in Almaty?
Good day. Well, thank you for inviting me, first of all. Do you hear me?
That's fine. Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Well, it's nice and sunny here. It's a wonderful day.
Well, it's a bit drizzly here, but I'm sure in Ukraine, the situation and what is happening there has impact on Kazakhstan. First of all, what's been the general reaction to this situation in Ukraine by Kazakhs, insofar as you can establish them?
Well, I think society is divided. The younger generation is more pro-Ukraine and pro-Western. Older people are, take the Russian line more.
Well, Russia is quite friendly. Russia is in many ways a very friendly country to Kazakhstan, as it is with the other countries described as stans. But then Ukraine also is one of the friends. So that puts Kazakhstan in a difficult position between the two combatants, if you like. But what, generally speaking, in terms of geopolitics in the area, let's start with the food crisis, for example. Do you think Kazakhstan might be affected by this?
Well, first of all, Kazakhstan's relations with Russia are more important than with Ukraine, so their interests lie that way. Kazakhstan, of course, is a major food-producing country, produces a lot of wheat. So if railways or transport could be found, then I'm sure they would export grain.
What do you think about the war situation in Ukraine itself? Russia says that, it needed to provide for its own security. Ukraine is saying that it's a sovereign country and should be able to decide what it wants. This has led to the current situation in the country. But speaking as a scholar and as an academic, what do you make of the whole situation?
Well, it's a total misconception that this has anything to do with Russian security. Ukraine was for a long time neutral under President Kuchma, going back to the 2000s. Ukraine was officially called to build itself as having a multi-vector policy. The large majority of the public wanted to have normal relations with Russia. Well, why wouldn't they? Russia would be, a major economic and trade partner. Ukraine is much smaller financially and in terms of population than Russia. So, of course, Ukraine wouldn't want to antagonize Russia and would have every interest in maintaining good relations with Russia. So the present conflict comes from, pure neo-colonialism and the expansionist policy of the government of Russia and Vladimir Putin. His popularity back prior to 2014 was falling a little bit because the economy, the oligarch-dominated economy, was not performing well. People were grumbling. So he launched the annexation of Crimea, which was popular. So it gave him a boost, his career a boost. And from then, a certain, political dynamic then continued. Russian propaganda, well, okay, they continue to sort of demonize Ukraine. And the tragic thing here is that the Russians believe their own propaganda. This is the bad thing. There's sort of, no off-ramp here. Putin has sort of made himself a victim of his own propaganda. He has alleged the oppression of Russians in Ukraine, the suppression of the Russian language. All of this is untrue. He's now saving the Russians in Ukraine, so to speak. He's invaded. He's gone in very deeply, and now there's no tactful way for him to pull out. The Russian army made a big blunder here. They're in Ukraine. That is, they're taking heavy losses. But the government and Putin keep pushing forward. It's sort of, they have a sort of a virtual Orwellian agenda. They want to, so to speak, denazify Ukraine, and nobody knows what that means. Apparently, it means removing all vestiges of Ukrainian language and cultural rights. Political rights, which is what they've been doing everywhere that they've occupied, in Crimea, in the Donbass, and in the areas that they occupied recently. They are arresting scholars, academics, journalists, clergy who are, or Ukrainian cultural figures. They're removing the Ukrainian and English languages from the curriculum. They're forcing Russian into the school curriculum. So the cause of the war and the agenda is pure, adventurism and neocolonialism and the popularity of the Putin regime. But this is unfortunately very tightly bound up with centuries-long mythologies that most Russians have about or against Ukraine.
But then the Russians, I don't know if it's a myth, but the Russians seem to be extremely strong on the ground. And even though you've referenced the fact that they've made a couple of mistakes in invading Ukraine, it does, even from the reporting this morning, we hear that virtually all of Severodonetsk is now within their control. And that would then possibly give them a land corridor all the way to Crimea. So is it, do you think, time for there to be some peace talks or an attempt at least to end the carnage while peace talks continue? Because the people who are bearing the brunt of this are those who actually live in Ukraine.
Peace would not bring security. In the areas of occupation, they're at random. The soldiers are poorly trained soldiers, and they have the tacit agreement of the government to abuse the population. Yet, about a month or two ago, when the Russian forces were north in the country of Kyiv, they were poorly supplied with food. And so Putin's government passed a law, that is a military law, allowing so-called self-sufficiency for the armed forces. What this meant is that Russian soldiers could just go to villagers' homes and break in and take their food and anything else that they wanted, refrigerators, laptops, washing machines, refrigerators, laptops, jewelry, anything that's handy. So that's systematic.
But then, does that give you, sorry, my apologies. My apologies. Please go on.
Russia wouldn't hold. Well, okay, they've overextended themselves. The Russian army has overextended itself, and now it probably now would like to have a ceasefire so as to be able to regroup its forces, because it's kind of a contradictory or an ambiguous situation. The Russian army occupies a lot of land, those territories that you mentioned, but its military situation is questionable and possibly, questionable. They have a high attrition rate. Their morale is low. The Ukrainians are waiting for heavy Western modern weapons to arrive. Some of these are now arriving at the front. And the Ukrainians think that in about a month, when more of the Western equipment arrives, that they will be able to go on a counteroffensive, and probably they would be successful. Well, at least partially successful. They will be able to drive back the Russian forces, in selected places, perhaps in the south. That remains to be seen. But the Ukrainians are far from giving up. And incidentally, the angriest Ukrainians are those who lost their homes because of bombing and shelling. So within Ukrainian society itself, there's no mood for a false peace. There's no mood for a surrender of any kind, because they're convinced that Putin and Russia wouldn't keep their word anyway. And I think this is true, that a peace would actually be more dangerous than war. I recall once hearing a lecture by a German scholar stating that, where she said that Stalin and Hitler killed more people during peacetime than during wartime. And if you read also this book by the American University professor Timothy Snyder called The Bloodlands, the area of Europe between Russia and Germany, that's true. So peace, unfortunately, does not bring security.
I must ask you, though, if you look at the wider situation, that not just the two major people who are actually in combat, that's Russia and Ukraine. You referenced it when you said that Ukraine is now about receiving heavy weapons from the West, Britain, from America, from Germany, and so on. But then on the other side, Russia is not without its friends either. Russia is receiving bulk payments as well from India. And then, of course, there's the big elephant, which is China, and which no one wants to face because of the same reason that we're trying to avoid direct confrontations with Russia. Now, those bigger players, those other players who have been brought in, are they complicating the matter, do you think, so that if and when there's even an attempt to resolve it, these other players will make that very difficult?
Well, yes, you make some very valid points. Yes, certainly the war has, ramifications beyond the immediate area. This is ambiguous. I think both sides, both the Russian and the Ukrainian sides, think they can win. So they're both, still, I think, looking for a military solution. It's anybody's guess how this will play out. Russia has lost, the Russian army has lost a lot of its best officers and equipment, but they have enormous, and they can't replace that with new equipment because, their military industrial complex is sort of in disarray, and also they depend on Western or foreign parts, components, and those are embargoed now. But they do have still enormous amounts of old Soviet equipment in reserve. It's anybody's guess also what condition this equipment is, but I saw a figure of 13,000 tanks, older ones, older non-modernized T-72s and T-64s and T-62s. Even if only a quarter of them are operationalizable, that's still 3,000 tanks. The bigger problem, the short-term problem anyway for Russia, is that it actually doesn't have many reserves. It has, on paper, a reserve force of 900,000, but these are actually just a list on a sheet of paper. These reserves don't actually, exist in barracks or collection points. And on the other hand, the Ukrainians have very many people who are ready to volunteer. In fact, the problem for the Ukrainian side is they don't have enough weapons for the people who want to volunteer. The Ukrainian government mentioned they could raise, 1,000 reservists, 1 million reservists, which they probably could, but they don't have weapons. So the problems are kind of opposite. The Russians have the weapons, but not the personnel, and the Ukrainians have the personnel, but not so far the weapons. Even when they do, the Ukrainians do get the advanced weapons. It's still questionable how these will actually perform. I've listened to some Ukrainian military experts, and they would need probably 3 times the number of weapons that are actually being delivered. So it's a very open question as to what impact the Western weapons will have. Although it's safe to say, and again, as the Ukrainian expert said, they have enough, the Ukrainians, to stop further Russian advance. It remains to be seen how much they'll be able to push the Russians back. That's in the short run. Over the long run, Russia is a huge country. And if they did go to a general mobilization, well, they have 140 million people there. Then, over the longer run, and if they can get, support from China and other places, well, then the Russian position would be improved. And of course, the Russians also are not standing still. They go to foreign countries where they, to which they used to export Soviet equipment or Russian equipment, and now they're trying to bring that back and spare parts. So I can't, I don't know how successful that is, but of course that would be a logical thing for them to do. So yes, the military situation, I think, is still very much, up in the air to be speculated on.
Well, all of this, of course, plays to the fact that we expect that so many days of conflict still lie ahead. It's not something that many people want to hear, but it does seem as if that is the realistic position on the ground. It's become a grinding war.
Yes. The Ukrainians wouldn't be attempting a counterattack until July, probably. This keeps getting pushed back because these Western weapons, are still en route somewhere. They're waiting, and they don't come. Germany blocks this. So even if this counteroffensive, and again, as I said, it's an open question how successful it would be, but even if it is successful, it would start only in July. And, obviously it takes several months at least. July, August, October, September, October. So, for this to work through. So, yes, obviously we're looking for, all indications are for a long war. And of course, the Ukrainian population is suffering terribly. Their economy, their infrastructure is, bombed out. So they're very dependent now on Western, both military and economic aid. And so it seems to me that the war now from the Ukrainian side is not even so much in a military dimension, but in a sort of a political and diplomatic dimension. Ukraine's success or failure militarily then depends on either the willingness or unwillingness of the Western countries to continue to supply military and financial assistance. And, as the war continues, there will be, tiredness, about this. So it's also then a very open question as to how long or if the Western consensus, such as it is, and it's not a complete consensus, will be for the support of Ukraine. So again, difficult to predict.
Yeah, lots of moving parts, lots of variables to consider there. But Professor Dennis Soltis, thank you so much for your perspective and for your time today on the program. Professor Soltis joins us from Almaty in Kazakhstan. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure.
And after the break, a Ukrainian refugee sees her belongings on a Russian tank in the news. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Curtis Adigba is a political analyst joining us virtually from the commercial capital of the country in Lagos. Good morning to you, Curtis. Thank you for your time. Can you hear me, Curtis?
All right, thank you.
It seems as if we're having some problems with your audio. But can you hear me, Curtis?
No, I can hear you.
All right, then. Our situation as it is now, when I say our, I mean those who are observing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that we seem to have settled in for a long grinding position, and the economic, political fallouts of all of this will continue for quite a while. Is that your reading as well?
Yes, I agree with you. You know, like we all know, this is not going to be a war that we have an easy winner, if there's going to be one at all. Because it's not just a war between Ukraine and Russia. It has become a proxy war where supporters of Russia are involved in certain ways, and supporters of Ukraine are also involved in supplying arms and giving some other help. So it has to be a diplomatic solution. There is not going to be an end to this war by fighting with hardwares and then gaining a victory.
Now, at that point, I'm happy you mentioned that, because my last guest, who was joining us from Kazakhstan, said the Ukrainians do not appear to be prepared to give up anything substantial in return for peace. And the Russians believe that in the medium to long term, they are going to grind this to a victory. That's so the motivation is not really there for peace talks. And that in any case, the Turks, who are trying to put together the peace talks themselves, are also concerned about food shortages and about being able to create a land corridor for food to move from Ukraine to other places even before we get to peace talks.
Yes, and you see, here the dynamics are constantly changing. Don't forget that Russia is not old. In other words, Russia is not the power that it used to be. Now, in the course of fighting this war, we have seen that several countries have imposed heavy sanctions on Russia. That's also hurting. So the ability of Russia to continue fighting at this level for as long as it will take is also in doubt. So the earlier we start looking at diplomacy in resolving this issue, the better for all. Because the effect and the impact on the global economy is here for all of us to see.
Now, of course, we can't look at this situation without taking a look at us. And when I say us, I mean back here on the African continent and including Nigeria. What I talked about, the food crisis, there are those who say that Nigeria itself will be affected by that, considering that we're a major importing country. We import virtually everything that we eat, starting from wheat to the oils and so on. And all these majorly come from these two countries. So the fight over being able to export grain is also in Nigeria's favor for it to be won. But we don't seem to be making any moves either to secure alternative supplies or to join the chorus to ensure that that export takes place.
Well, Ladi, you know that as a country, we have fundamental problems. As you also know, most of our farmers today cannot go to their farms. If you understand what I mean.
I do.
Because of the insecurity situation. So we've had to rely on export for as long as we all know. But now that we are not able to bring grain from Ukraine and other parts of the world, we are beginning to see the impact on our daily living. Now, in the last 1 or 2 months, bread, common staple on our tables, have moved all over Lagos. I mean, we're witnessing astronomical rise in the prices of bread. From 450, it is now about 1,000 for a loaf of bread for most people. So, and that is the impact. And there are other impacts, economic impacts. And the reality is that, you know, when people think about what is happening in Russia and Ukraine, the tendency is to think that it's not our problem. Ukraine and Russia, they are far away from us. But what people do not understand is that the world is interconnected in certain ways. That whatever is happening somewhere else that you think is not your problem and should have no impact on you, in reality, they determine how you live in your own small space. And so it is time, like I've said, for countries of the world and leaders to come together and begin to look at diplomacy, you know, in attempts to resolve this problem. This is not going to end by fighting.
That's a lot to think about. Curtis Adigba, thank you for your time this morning. As always, we'll be getting back to you as time progresses for more perspectives on what is happening in that theater of war. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
China's telecommunications giant Huawei has begun closing its retail outlets in Russia, in part due to a decrease in demand. Moscow's state news agency, RIA, reported citing a source close to the company. According to the news agency, 4 of Russia's 19 stores have now closed, and RIA says it is likely the rest will follow soon. A shortage of products in warehouses was another reason given by the source. Let's talk now to Laddie Williams, as we do, for more on this and other stories out of this conflict. Morning, Laddie.
Morning.
Russian inflation slowed to 17.1% in May. You called this because earlier this week you suggested that
exactly.
That would be
and you know, with the meeting coming up, this will actually spur them to actually cut rates even more. And this was quite expected. You know, seeing a currency strengthen. And you're also seeing local demand, you know, actually plunge at this time in Russia. So it's quite expected that inflation will actually, you know, come down with all of that happening. But analysts still believe this is temporary because at the end of the day, costs could still, you know, cost pressures could still resurge due to the shortages, you know, they're having because of the sanctions,
right?
You know, all of that. So at the end of the day, it's good news. They're bucking the trend, you know, with what's happening globally. But at the end of the day, how sustainable is it going to be? That's the question.
The other thing when you talk about sustainability, and which we also talked about, is that the ruble, which at the point was about 160 to the US dollar near the start of this conflict, has now firmed past 60 on its way down against the same dollar. Is this as a result of what you just talked about?
Yes, it actually touched about 59 rubles to the dollar, but it's been ranging between that 59 spot and the 62, you know, on the exchange. And at the end of the day, the capital controls have, you know, they've played their part, they've done the work, but now it's a little counterproductive with their exports, because when you have a stronger currency, it kind of makes your exports more expensive for importing countries. But now analysts say that, you know what, they're easing their capital controls now, but it might not help, you know, reduce the strength of the ruble. Because we're seeing as the ruble is getting stronger, they're easing controls, but it's still getting stronger. They're trying to, you know, rein it down a bit, try to, you know, slow that run. But as it goes now, by Friday, we'll see the Russia Central Bank actually move to reduce rates more, and that would actually strengthen the ruble even more, even as they continue to, you know, so it remains to be seen how it all plays out.
But between the devil and the deep blue sea.
Exactly.
Laddie, of course, will have details, more breakdowns and perspectives of all these stories, along with Ini John McWa on our business programs during the course of today. But for now, Ladi, thanks.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of the sports stories that have emanated from this conflict. The International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach has asked the Association of Summer Olympic International Federations that they must make their own responses to the war in Ukraine or risk becoming a political tool. Drawing on the example of tennis, Mr. Bach cautioned against governments influencing decisions on the participation of athletes from Russia and Belarus. Mr. Bach insisted that the IOC's ban on Russian and Belarusian teams had been imposed because Russia had violated the Olympic truce, which had been agreed by the United Nations before Beijing 2022. And controversial Russian gymnast Ivan Kolyak has filed an appeal against the Gymnastic Ethics Foundation's Disciplinary Commission's decision to suspend him for a year. Kolyak wore the letter Z, a symbol associated with Russia's military operation during the International Gymnastics Federation Apparatus World Cup in Doha in March. He also wore the letter during the medal ceremony for the parallel bars, which was won by Ukrainian Ilya Kovtun. The Gymnast Ethics Foundation then suspended the athlete and ordered him to return his bronze medal and the prize money of $500 and was ordered to pay costs of $2,000. And finally, on the program, a Ukrainian refugee who escaped the war in her hometown of Popasna in the country's embattled east and resettled in Britain with her 2 children woke up one morning to a message on a phone from her husband. His message was a photograph and the words, "Do you notice anything strange?" It was then, says Alina Koreniuk, that she looked closely at the photograph her husband sent and recognized her personal possessions apparently removed from her home, which she left behind. The photograph shows a soldier atop a Russian tank marked with the letter Z, laden with a cardboard box and blankets, driving past destroyed buildings in the city of Popasna in Luhansk region. Koreniuk says she looked at the photo closely and spotted her children's bed linen, an old blanket, and even an oilcloth from her home on the tank. Koreniuk, who was a police officer in Popasna, left Ukraine with her 2 daughters in early April. She is now staying with a British family in Nottinghamshire under the Homes for Ukrainians scheme. Koreniuk says she did not expect her story to garner so much public attention, but she decided to share it because there will be many, many more Ukrainians who face a similar situation. She says she hopes to give her children a reprieve from the current situation in Ukraine, with her husband, mother, and grandmother still there. Thoughts of returning home are still on her mind, but she says it will only be possible if Ukraine has control of her city. That's our program this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akiri-Duluali. There's an update within the world today, later on in the day at 5 o'clock. For now, have a pleasant day ahead.